Hello, everyone. Welcome to Psychedelic Insights. Adam and I today have the pleasure of having on Brom Rector, founding partner at Empath Ventures, and Samantha Tabone, partner at Empath Ventures. Back when I started wanting to learn more about investing in psychedelic medicine companies, Brom was my go-to for learning more about the space and doing due diligence. And, he used to do incredible deep dives on the space and on individual companies, fantastic interviews with different companies. And he actually recently put out a podcast about the economics of psychedelic medicine, which is fantastic. I was introduced to Samantha Tabone by watching how psychedelic VCs do due diligence in the space. And if anyone has the chance, definitely check that video out. So I'm looking forward today to speaking with Brom and Samantha to learn more about the psychedelic medicine space as a whole and learn more about some of the companies their fund is invested in. And Adam, I'll give it to you here. And you guys, if you want to say anything to start off.
Yeah, well, thanks for the great intro. I mean, you're making me blush a little bit. That making those YouTube videos that you're referencing, it feels like a whole lifetime ago at this point. A lot has happened since then. Those were back in like 2021 when I had left my job at a hedge fund and was just kind of not really sure what I was doing in life, honestly, but I had been following the psychedelic space and thought that it was very fascinating that there were like psychedelic stocks. I had been personally interested in psychedelics for like a decade at that point, but it was really a surprise to me that all of a sudden you could like buy shares in a company that was doing research on LSD or MDMA. And I had left my job and I was like, maybe I should just talk about these companies because there's literally no one online talking about them. And at that point, I never even had the intention of like starting a fund or anything. I was just making the videos for the fun of it. And eventually those videos led me to get in the mix of like a lot of deal flow, and people were asking me for investment advice. And I was like, maybe I should do a fund. So those videos were kind of the origin story of the whole Empath Ventures thing.
Yeah. So it's
glad you liked them.
Cool. And time's really flown by since then. I feel like COVID made everything move faster as well. You started making those videos around COVID. Is that correct? Or
it was a little bit late. It was a little bit later in. It was like, I think March 2021 is when I started making those videos just out of a hobby, and then started Empath later on, like in September of that year, which was kind of like right when the market, not just the psychedelics market, but everything was peaking. And so set up the infrastructure for a fund, set out to raise 10 million for the first fund. We've raised close to half of that so far. I met Samantha later on in the journey. I didn't know her at that point, but I come from the hedge fund world. Like my background's in computer science and finance. And even though I've absorbed a lot of science through osmosis, I don't have like a background in drug discovery or pharmacology or anything. And I was introduced to Samantha pretty randomly, just through someone that we both happen to know. And I'll let her give her background in a sec, but I ended up hiring her to do technical due diligence on a company that we were looking at, a company called Silo, which is doing like new chemical entities. And I recorded a really cool podcast with the scientific officer from Silo. I recommend checking that out if you're interested, but hired Sam to do due diligence on that company. And we ended up liking working together so much that decided to just continue working on a more full-time basis. And so now both of us are running the fund together, and it's been awesome. Do you want to kind of give your story, Sam?
Yeah, why not? Nice to meet you guys. As Brom mentioned, I have a science background, so it's been interesting looking at how a lot of these companies evolve over time. I'll talk about my background in a second, but I think probably around the time that Brom started his podcast until now, we've seen like a huge divergence in the type of chemicals that are being looked at and the strategy of a lot of the biotech companies. But my training is in drug discovery, chemistry. I did all of that in academia. I've spent the past 8 years working with early stage therapeutics companies at that interface between technical and commercial. So a lot of the work I've done, I've worked with companies that are looking at developing drugs for various therapeutic areas, but I've been specifically interested in neuro, CNS, neuropsychiatry, neurodegenerative disease for most of my career. And I got, attracted to the psychedelic ecosystem 4 years ago when I met an individual and I started a company looking at psychedelics for neurodegenerative diseases with her. And then from there, I started working with other companies in the ecosystem too. You mentioned the technical DD. podcast, how psychedelic VCs do due diligence. I've spent time with other types of investment firms in the past also doing this type of thing for very niche emerging areas in drug discovery, but have been specifically excited about the psychedelic space just because there's so much attention on it with so many people at one time. And so that was a really fun podcast to record. But yeah, the science is definitely getting more and more interesting as time goes on.
Yeah. And maybe one thing that I could talk about just to kind of set the stage is just to give a quick overview of like what Empath is and the types of investing that we do. Would that kind of be helpful?
Totally.
Go ahead. So, when you stumbled upon those videos I was making on YouTube back in the day, I was talking about publicly traded companies, which, makes a lot of sense if you're like trying to get an audience, because the audience can invest in those publicly traded companies, right? But Empath, it was started as a venture capital firm. So we only invest in private companies that have not IPO'd yet. And specifically, we're focused on investing at the very early stages. So the majority of the money that we've invested has gone into companies that are like at the pre-seed stage or the seed stage. So these are companies that generally, they could just be a couple of folks and a pitch deck. They may have not even actually made any progress on the business yet, just like getting money for the idea. Sometimes the companies are a little bit more evolved and are just looking for a little bit of capital to go to the next level. We are generally writing checks of between $100,000 to $200,000 into those companies, which is maybe a lot from a retail investor perspective, but in terms of the amount of capital a company needs to move forward, 100 to 200,000 doesn't move the needle that much. So we're usually not the only investor in a company. We usually invest alongside of a lot of other funds. So a big part of our job is not just finding companies to invest in, but also like helping them meet other funds that can put in the rest of the money that they need to raise, and trading notes on companies with other investors as well. The private markets have very, very different dynamics than the public markets do. So that's kind of like the type of investing we do. And in terms of what we actually invest in, it's generally focused on psychedelic medicine. But we invest kind of across the entire spectrum of the psychedelic medicine industry. So we've invested in companies that are doing drug development, like trying to get existing psychedelics approved by the FDA. We've invested in companies that are doing drug discovery, like trying to invent new psychedelic drugs. We've invested in an ibogaine clinic down in Mexico, which is like a totally different model. We've invested in a ketamine telehealth platform. And we've even started investing in some stuff that's like not really psychedelic, but could be useful alongside a psychedelic therapy, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, brain stimulating devices and that sort of thing. So we've done 14 companies so far, spread out all across that whole like ecosystem.
And Brom, I have a question for you. We'll just get started right here. So the fact that you guys invest so early stage, which by the way, that sounds very exciting. Is it, you have to be an accredited investor to invest in private companies. Do you look for even more of a higher net worth than an average fund, maybe, considering how early you get in? And my next question would be, what are the percent, what are the chances a company goes from seed to a Series A? How many of them make it onto a Series A?
That's a good question. That first question you asked, could you kind of rephrase that? I'm not sure that I got what you meant there. You said you were looking for like high net worth.
Yeah. Sorry if I were wrong. Badly.
In terms of the people that invest in our fund?
Yeah. So, typically accredited investor, you need a certain net worth, or you have to make a certain amount of money per year.
Right.
But I know some funds invest maybe later stage, and you guys are specifically very early stage. So in a sense, I assume that makes it riskier. Would your fund require someone to have even higher of a net worth than a?
No, it's a good question. I mean, we just follow the standard and accredited investor requirements. So the same requirements that any other fund would do.
Awesome. And
some of our investors are very, very high net worth, but some of them are just kind of barely above that accredited investor line. It's kind of all over the map.
And what are the chances? I guess maybe it's different in all venture capital, maybe biotech. There's a specific percentage that go on from a seed round to a Series A. Like, what are you looking for there? What are the chances percentage wise?
I mean, I think, like you said, there's a lot of different factors that can influence it. I think, it's probably fair to assume maybe a 50% attrition rate across
Okay.
each round. So like maybe 50% from C to Series A, 50% from Series A to Series B, et cetera. Obviously, that's going to change a lot depending on, a multitude of different factors. Another way to think about it is that in like the biotech realm specifically, and Sam can speak more to this, but oftentimes those rounds are somewhat tied to like the stage of clinical development. So, you get that Series A once you've gotten like a drug approved to start human trials. And then maybe you get a Series B once you're kind of like into the phase 2. And when you look at like psychiatric drug development, there's like different the FDA, even on their own website, will tell you like what the probability of going from phase 1 to phase 2 is, and from phase 2 to phase 3 is. And there have been studies that show that those percentages are different depending on the disease area. So like psychiatry has a different set of probabilities than like cancer might, for example. Sam, what did I miss there?
I think generally you got the gist of it. I mean, I think what's important to remember is that not all seed stage or pre-seed stage biotech companies are starting out on the same footing. Some companies will have better IP and more data than others, and therefore they end up ahead, and it might be easier for them to raise a Series A when they go out and raise it because they're just that further along in the drug development life cycle. But generally speaking, I'd say that when we're looking at these early stage companies, we do our best in accordance with what we talked about on that podcast to try and understand whether or not there's a higher likelihood of these companies maybe making it through to a Series A round. However, there also are factors that are out of the direct control of the founders, such as the macro environment, also the availability of later stage funding, and perhaps even FDA guidances that can influence this too.
Yeah. And one thing that I will point out, Jake, just to touch more on the difference between like public markets investing and private markets investing is like, if you invest in a public market, it's like you just buy a stock, you pretty much buy the stock and like you sit back and watch. There's not much you can do, right?
Yeah.
When you're investing in the private markets, like when you put that money into the company, like there's no, rules about like quarterly reporting and information flow and stuff. So you get updates, you're allowed to interface with the management, and you can sometimes like influence the direction of the company a little bit.
Wow.
So like, and I don't mean that in like a nefarious way or anything. I'm saying like, if we get involved, part of like the criteria for us investing is not just do we think like the founders are good and their idea is good, but to some extent, it's also a criteria for us to be like, based on our network and our expertise, do we actually add value beyond the cash and improve the likelihood of a company like being able to succeed? Like through Sam's connections, can we introduce this company to a partner that might improve the likelihood of them, raising that next round or getting through those clinical milestones? So there's like a level of influence that you can have on those probabilities too.
Oh, that's really cool. The last part you mentioned there about actually taking an active role and maybe helping out with the companies is something I would definitely love to learn more about. I actually didn't know too much about that before, so thank you. Adam, I'm going to hand it off to you here.
All right. So which first-gen psychedelics are you two most excited about? Are there any trials in particular that you are looking forward to seeing the results of? And last part, perhaps due to those results having implications for next-gen psychedelics that your portfolio companies are working with?
Sam, do you want to go first?
I mean, so there's a lot of data already around MDMA and COMP360 from MAPS and Compass. I'm particularly excited about Compass, but if we're talking about it from a purely molecular perspective, I've always been very excited about DMT, and I have my reasons for it. There are a lot of trials that are claiming to either want to be including or are including DMT. I don't have my eye on any one in particular yet, just because I don't know what the likelihood of these trials continuing are given like the funding situation. But any DMT trial I pay particular attention to, that's for sure.
And does that include 5-MeO DMT, which by the way, I think not enough people are talking about 5-MeO DMT. I am super excited for, Beckley SciTech and GH Research to put out their later stage data. So are you looking at 5-MeO also?
Yeah, I definitely am. However, that little methoxy group, the little carbon and the oxygen that you add onto the original DMT core makes a huge difference in terms of the patient experience. So I'm cautiously optimistic about 5-MeO DMT, and I'm intrigued to see how the administration techniques that companies use will change to control that intense experience. But definitely interested in the tryptamines as far as, like stroke intervention goes. I'm very interested in that area, but I think Brom may have a different answer.
Jake, and when you talk about 5-MeO, you should check out the company Lusaris. They're a private company that raised like $60 million and then just like disappeared. Like their website got deleted. Yeah, kind of crazy.
I made a video about GH research and competition in the 5-MeO space, and then like a week after I made it, I was like, oh, it doesn't look like Lusaris is around. And
super weird, right?
I've asked some people around, and it seems that a hypothesis is that their delivery method with the strip, they might have ran into some trouble with that. And I'm going to be quite honest here, being in a Thai investor with VLS-01, that being on a oral transmucosal film, I'm a little worried for that trial, but I hope it goes well. But yeah, no, Lusaris is, I guess, gonzo.
Yeah, kind of crazy.
It is.
So my answer to that question about first generations would be ibogaine. And the reason is, one, the research around like what ibogaine can do is it's less far along than the research around like psilocybin and MDMA, but the early research that does exist around ibogaine is just so incredible. It seems like, it might be the closest thing to a miracle drug that's ever existed in terms of like being able to treat traumatic brain injury and opiate addiction and all these things. But the reason that I'm so excited about it from sort of like a commercialization perspective is that when you think about like Comp 360, for example, or psilocybin, I like Compass and think it's a good investment, but they're really competing with everyone that can just do shrooms in their backyard, right? No one just like gets some ibogaine and hangs out with their friends in their backyard and does it, right? Like if you're doing ibogaine, you literally, it's so risky and intense that you need professionals, medical supervision, and like a protocol to safely do it. And so I think that like, in terms of getting some sort of like medicalized ibogaine protocol approved by the FDA, that to me seems like a game changer. And it doesn't have any competition from like, let's call it the recreational or like non-medical market for the most part. So super stoked on ibogaine.
And Brom, and I heard the ibogaine experience isn't really recreational at all. From what I've heard. And by the way, I know you guys are invested in Beyond. That's what it's called, Beyond, right? That's awesome. For people to be able to go there and get this treatment that, people just, some people just don't have physical withdrawal symptoms anymore after an experience, which is, it's remarkable. I would like to ask you, and if you don't feel comfortable answering this, you don't have to, but how do you like the odds of, Demrex getting this thing across the FDA finish line?
Yeah, I will say that I am not super close to like the public market companies these days, just because we're focused on the private. But I think the main issue with like any drug getting approved by the FDA is that the FDA is always like safety first, right? Like that's their main concern. Safety number one, and then efficacy second. So they need to show that they can somehow make it safe, or they need to go after an indication that is so risky, like maybe a high degree of substance abuse, where the risk is worth the potential reward. If that makes sense. I don't know, Sam, what do you think? Sam's the expert on clinical trials here. I'm just a layman.
Yeah, I really don't have too much to say that's different than what you said. I think what you said about the safety first and therapeutic efficacy second is something that will drive a lot of strategy in terms of how some of these first generation companies may have pivoted from their original business plans when they realize that maybe, once the first generation compounds from these other companies are approved, they may not have much to go off of. So just my general sentiment, because I'm not really an expert in the public markets at all, when it comes to first generation psychedelics, is that there's a handful of companies that will be able to stake their claim on the approval. And then once that's done, it's very easy for a company that has their claim on a first generation psychedelic as an FDA approved therapy to perhaps raise more money and maybe repurpose their own drug into another indication. And so when I think about analyzing these clinical trials, maybe let's say 5 or 6 that are, I don't know, using my favorite, DMT. The first one of those companies to get approval for DMT for whatever indication area is probably in a better position to reposition for a secondary or tertiary, like neuropsychiatric indication, than maybe some of these other companies that are kind of trudging along. So my general sentiment there is kind of the first generation psychedelics, or the second generations that have maybe a small tweak that I wouldn't even consider a new molecule, but are just like an inspired derivative of first generation psychedelics. I think, their best bet is to probably generate new data in like riskier, more high impact potential therapeutic areas like Brom mentioned.
Yeah. And do you know, is DemiRx, are they proposing like some kind of special safety protocol that goes along? I imagine they are.
Yeah, well, we actually got to have Florian and Srini come on, and it seems like in their phase 1 that they did through and over in the UK, that the results of their phase 1 matched what's in the literature already, I guess, because I know Deborah Mash she's been researching Ibogaine for decades.
Long time.
Decades. And they didn't get too specific, but again, it matched what's in the literature already. I think they know the risks pretty well, is kind of the vibes I got, and they are planning to engage with the regulatory agencies to assess going into a proof of concept trial. And Srini said that if we're looking at acne, perhaps Ibogaine's not going to be like, let's say I'm trying to give an example of something that's not gonna. Okay, where I'm going here is opioid use disorder kills.
Yeah.
Like 80,000 people a year. So if this thing, the risk, again, just risk benefit here, and they're gonna assess that with these regulatory agencies, and I'm hopeful that it'll be successful.
Me too.
Yeah.
So are there any trials in particular that you guys are looking forward to seeing the results of?
Sam, do you have something there you want to talk about?
I mean, I'm pretty interested in just following GH research in particular overall. I'm very interested to see what a lot of the existing portfolio companies will get to once they get to a phase 2, but that's a ways away in terms of clinical trials.
Yeah, with the exception of MAPS, most of our portfolio companies haven't actually started human trials yet, so it's still very early. But we're investors in MAPS, and or MAPS PBC, right. And so we're excited to see what that phase 3 looks like. And then, some of the companies that we invested in are doing some interesting things. And once those clinical trials start, I will be really excited to see the results. One in particular, Silo, they have a couple of, Silo is basically trying to invent psychedelic drugs that are not part of any of the existing classes of psychedelic drugs. So not tryptamines, not phenethylamines, et cetera. And some of those are psychoactive, and then some of them are actually some of them are like psychedelic, meaning that they have a hallucinogenic experience. And some of them, at least according to the plan, are not going to be psychedelic. And there are other companies doing similar things like Delix and Gilgamesh out there. We haven't really heard a lot of reports of like humans taking these non-psychedelic psychedelics before. We don't really know what a human is going to experience when they take one of these non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. Like, according to what's that?
Sorry to interrupt. Did you see that post by Josh Hardman? He found some Reddit group that actually.
Yeah, I saw that. They were Tabernathalog or whatever. Yeah, the Delix one. And that's tough, right? Because who knows if that person was even taking Tabernathalog, unless they had, someone sold them something and told them that's what it was, but it wasn't done under laboratory conditions. But I think we just don't know, right? And it'll be really interesting to see what those end up being like in the body. So excited to see what that is.
And Silo, that's what I'm very fascinated with. Silo and Mind State Design Labs in particular. In your portfolio, fascinating companies. Sam, I'd like to get back with what you're saying about GH Research. So, full disclosure, I hold GH Research. I'm really excited about them. And although I don't have a science background, when I look at them and I hear about 5-MeO, it's a very overwhelming experience. And some people don't love the fact Adam's laughing because we talk about this all the time. Some people think it's not going to be meant for everyone, and it's probably the case. It won't be. I think it'll be great for TRD. It's just what I think. But the way they dose the drug with the individualized dosing regimen, I think is that unique in the space with how they're doing that?
Yeah, I'd say any kind of individualized dosing regimen is unique. I mean, I believe they're in phase 2 right now with their lead candidate. Usually, I mean, there's like this new style of doing clinical trials now that we're moving into an era of precision medicine across all therapeutic areas, not just oncology, where you can do adaptive trials. You can do these things called basket trials where maybe you have different dosing regimens across multiple arms to see what's optimal given holding other things constant. But I think you're right to note that 5-MeO-DMT is a very intense experience. I don't know that personally. I think I'd be scared to try just given some of the videos I've seen on YouTube. But at the same time, I think that delivery systems and the way that we try to optimize drugs for what is called pharmacokinetics and not pharmacodynamics. So we're not just optimizing for safety and efficacy, but now optimizing for how it is distributed throughout the body and to what degree. I think that it is quite achievable to maybe get a different experience based on pharmacokinetic adjustments. I don't know how realistic it is in terms of how you change your delivery system, but I suspect that that's something they've been thinking about. And, going back to Luceris and how you mentioned you suspect it might be because of the sublingual strip, if you think about how quick acting that is, if you get the dosing wrong and you give it to a population of people who have never had any kind of experience before, that's going to be something. So, I think over time, we might see more personalized dosing, but it is definitely something unique.
Yeah. And, just sorry to stick on GH, we'll move on here. Just, they start, I think it's cool because, they start off with 6 milligrams. If the person doesn't reach a peak experience, then they'll move to 12 and then 18. So maybe it helps them. Actually, I think I looked through their patent filings and they talked about how they believe their dosing regimen will work someone their way up to the peak experience without being overwhelming. So I'm,
interesting
with them.
So I guess, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the details of their trial, but when you're conducting clinical trials, it's often common to have different arms with different dosing schedules and doses. So are you saying that now they have like a dose escalation for each patient and then they keep them at the dose that they're comfortable with? Is that what you're saying?
So they did they had one trial where they looked at individual doses, with each person. Then they had what's called the individualized dosing regimen arm of the trial, which they're going to use for their phase 2B. So everyone's going to get this individualized dosing regimen. So some people will only need 6 milligrams to get a peak experience. And then others, they'll start with 6 milligrams. And I don't know how they measure it, but if they didn't reach a peak experience, they'll move on to the 12 milligram dose. And then some people require 18. From what I saw, most people in their IDR part of their phase 2A, which was very small, but I thought the results were incredible. It seems like most people needed the 6 and then the 12. And
interesting.
Yeah.
And if this is an earlier phase 2 study, this kind of exploration makes sense to me. What my concern is, what I'm hearing is that they haven't been able to really map, it sounds like, what the expected ideal dose should be given someone's sex, age, and weight. And so, but then again, I haven't tried 5-MeO-DMT, so maybe it's just variable depending on random things like that aren't related to those factors. But it sounds like for something as intense as 5-MeO-DMT that it makes sense to do something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think specifically with 5-MeO-DMT and NN-DMT to a lesser extent, like starting low and titrating upwards, you get the person, the client, the patient used to the body load and the psychedelic space that they're in, and then it can make it more comfortable as you titrate higher. And specifically with 5-MeO-DMT being as intense as it is, I can see that being of value there.
So
definitely.
All right, so this question is for Sam. I read in your bio that you have been interested in DMT for a while. Is this NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, or both? And can you explain what made you so interested in DMT specifically?
It's a very funny story. Full disclosure, I haven't tried either of them.
No way.
And I'm very specific. Well, that's not
Wait,
true.
yeah, that's not
Yeah,
true.
it's not true. That's not true. Just remembered. I am specifically interested in and have always been interested in N,N-dimethyltryptamine, so DMT. And it's funny because when I was in high school thinking about what I wanted to do for my undergrad, chemistry was kind of everywhere, but I hadn't decided on it yet. And at the same time, I started getting these really weird, intense, frequent sleep paralysis episodes. It's something I've kind of suffered with my entire life. I say this in quotations because I'm able to now kind of turn it into a lucid dream when it happens instead. But it got to the point where it was so intense, I went down a rabbit hole of what's happening with me medically. I don't want to have these experiences every single night. How can I fix this? And then I ended up going down this rabbit hole of, well, your brain maybe produces endogenous DMT and that's released when you sleep. And perhaps there's a link between people who lucid dream and get sleep paralysis quite a bit. None of that has been proven out. But it introduced me to this book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which Rick Strassman wrote. He's one of the original researchers who used DMT in his own clinical trials in the 90s. And they got shut down, but now he's working with one of the companies in this space. And ever since then, I've just been fascinated with this idea that maybe there's a chance that when we all pass away, our brain releases a copious amounts of this endogenous molecule that gives us a near life or near death experience or actual death experience. Yeah. All this to say, I haven't had one of those like breakthrough DMT sessions where I see aliens, the stuff that Joe Rogan talks about. But I'm hesitant to do that just given my sleep paralysis history and whatnot.
Got it.
That's really interesting. So DMT is my number one psychedelic. Very, very big fan of DMT in general. But I also feel like for therapeutic purposes, in terms of biotech, out the box, it is almost perfect in terms of the duration, and I think it would be amazing for a clinical setting. You don't have to be there for 7 to 8 hours. It would be much shorter. So I just think I'm very excited about a lot of the work that's being done around DMT in general. 5-MeO-DMT, I am a fan of. I just think that the intensity of the experience can be a roadblock for some, whereas NN-DMT is a bit more accessible and even playful in some capacities in regards to the psychedelic experience you're getting, whereas 5-MeO is straight up just ego death. There isn't really much in between there. But yeah, that's just my perspective on it.
And when it comes to these, psychedelics, I think there also needs to be a distinction between when someone with, the companies that all of us here are talking about today, they're looking at mental health disorders specifically. I think there's probably a big difference between when, someone maybe who's not dealing with treatment-resistant depression takes 5-MeO or NN-DMT versus someone who does. So that's definitely an area I've always been interested in learning the distinctions about.
I would also point out though, real quick, Jake, that we are looking. Oh, someone's phone's going off. One of the things that we're very excited about is psychedelics used outside of mental health areas. Obviously mental health is the frontier, but beyond that, there's other potential use cases. So things like neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's. We actually invested in a company called Canna Health, which if you go to their website, Canna, K-A-N-N-A, canna.health, I think is the website, you'll see that the indication that they're going after, one of my favorite indications in the portfolio, they're trying to cure premature ejaculation in men. That's right. We got some sexual health issues as well. So we are trying to figure out how psychedelics can be used beyond the garden variety mental health indications.
Okay, I see. I apologize for incorrect.
Oh, no worries.
So, by the way, Canna, they're part of.
I don't know, honestly.
They're part of Pangea Botanica, right? They're almost like a platform company.
Yeah. So Pangea was originally set up kind of in a similar fashion to how Atai, has the platform. There's the parent company and then the platform. And Canna was one of their first platform subsidiary companies and is the in terms of clinical progression, probably the furthest along.
Cool.
Yeah,
I've heard
they're affiliated.
Yeah, I've heard they're a company to look out for from multiple people. So it's exciting.
Yeah, I think watching Pangea and Canna would probably be, wise. I think there'll be some interesting things coming out. We're investors in both.
Awesome.
All right. So one of your portfolio companies, Mindstate Design Labs, seems to believe that the trip is most important when looking at the therapeutic value of these medicines for indications such as PTSD and depression, rather than just neuroplasticity, for example, being most important. Why do they believe this?
Yeah. Well, Mindstate, Sam is like Mindstate's biggest fan. So maybe you should answer this one, Sam.
They're awesome.
I mean, I'll give my take too, but.
Yeah, okay, I'll be brief. So, I mean, I think there's this idea. So there's like these two general ideas in psychedelic drug discovery. One is like the non-hallucinogenic versus hallucinogenic, and whether or not you can replicate the same efficacy in a treatment setting. Then there's like a whole other school of thought where it's like not one versus the other, but maybe both. But perhaps this idea of the subjective effect is actually what's driving all of this therapeutic benefit in the variety of psychiatric indications that are being looked at. And so there's academics, there's industrial folks, there's investors in all of these different camps. And the reason why I think, Mindstate Design Labs is so exciting is because they're trying to quantify the different types of the psychedelic experience. I'll cite my personal experience, one of my few personal experiences with psychedelics. I recently tried some psilocybin, and the idea of what makes up a hallucination or a subjective experience that is very experiential and phenomenological was very funny to me when I was experiencing the mushroom trip, because I'm like, how can you even describe this? There are just so many different elements of the experience. And when people think of hallucinations, they think of just something appearing in front of them. That's not what it was at all. And so I remember this happening and I started laughing, thinking about this idea of being able to understand what the subjective experience actually was right now from a scientific perspective. It's totally impossible to, unless you do the type of work that I think Mindstate is doing. So that's my long-winded way of saying, I think what they're doing is really cool. And I knew Brom would probably tell me to answer that question because I'm such a fan.
Yeah, and I mean, more specifically, like what they are doing is they are a drug development company, but their basic idea is like, we're going to really try and hone in on what types of drugs you can combine to create specific types of psychedelic states. And one of the ways that they do this is by building, they've used some like natural language processing technology to like analyze tens of thousands of trip reports that they found online, and basically figured out how to like describe a psychedelic experience along like a number of different vectors. So there's, like oceanic boundlessness is one of those things that comes up. They have ego death, is things that comes up, feelings of self-love that comes up. And they've kind of figured out, like, out of all the like these thousands of trip reports that are online, you can like reduce the experiences down to maybe, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, maybe, I'm not exactly sure how many, but they've kind of isolated a number of factors that are relevant to each of them. And then because these trip reports are usually describing a specific molecule, you can kind of build a map from like, this molecule induces this feeling. And so if we want a trip that gives us like these three feelings, here are the drugs that we need to combine in this way. And they're using that machine learning model to guide their drug discovery efforts.
That's incredible. Talk about innovation. That's so exciting. And I'm glad we're talking about the subjective effects here, because, someone working at the company, Josie Kins, I believe it's pronounced.
Yes.
Her YouTube videos, she had one called The 7 Levels of the Psychedelic Experience. I couldn't believe how accurate the visual, at least in my experience, like for the levels that I had reached. I didn't reach the 7th level that she brought up, but the levels that I had reached with the visuals, I just thought I couldn't believe how accurate it was, at least in my experience. And so where I'm going with this is, with her knowledge of the subjective effects of psychedelics, what does she bring to Mind State?
Yeah, well, she has that knowledge, and she it's embarrassing that I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but she started a website that collects a lot of trip reports.
Psychonaut Wiki.
Right, Psychonaut Wiki, right. So if you're from, which I don't know why I couldn't think of that, but I think that she just has access to all of these trip reports, and has been working in this field of like curating psychedelic experience for a long time. And so, I think having her on board is probably a big asset to that sort of machine learning phenomenological model that they're building out. And you mentioned like her videos on YouTube and the fact that she has this Psychonaut Wiki project. As far as I'm aware, Mind State is really the one company out there that is doing extremely rigorous drug development and has like a real experienced pharma team, but is really embracing like the trip aspect of psychedelics. It seems like all the other companies, even companies that are not trying to remove the trip, almost like downplay the trip part, right? Like Compass Pathways doesn't really talk about the trip being like front and center, whereas Mind State is like, we are going to design the perfect trip and it's going to be sick, which I think is really cool. But they have the actual like pharma credibility to do it. Like Dylan is a very experienced pharma operator.
And it's funny, I follow Dylan on Twitter. Every time there's more news that the trip is vital to the experience, he'll tweet about it like right away. I remember when our ketamine results came out, he's like, see, like you need the
yes,
you need the trip. So
he's a big believer in the trip.
Yeah, it's been really cool following them, and hopefully maybe we could get Dylan on one day.
It's probably very possible.
Yeah,
I would say. Yeah.
So I guess moving on to Silo, another company I'm fascinated with. Like you said, they're making just completely novel psychedelics. It's not just a tweak here and there on the molecule for maybe patent protection or just other stuff. They're really trying to do some completely new stuff here. So Sam, for someone without a background in science, how do you create a brand new psychedelic?
That's a good question. I mean, that's difficult to do without trying it yourself along the way. That's for sure. Because I'm pretty sure these mouse models aren't really giving us the full picture in terms of the psychedelic experience, which is another story. But for someone who doesn't have a background in science, I mean, we're living in an age now where computational tools are really being leveraged to screen libraries of compounds, and so in traditional drug discovery, if you're doing it in a lab, let's say for a company or for an academic group, you would have something going on called a medicinal chemistry campaign. And so you have chemists working in the lab. Usually they'll synthesize a library of a couple hundred molecules, and then they screen them in these really preliminary assays, they're called, which don't really represent the human experience, but they represent fractions of it in isolation.
Sorry to interrupt. Is it in like animal cells, or you're talking before that? Like
before that, they're called in vitro studies. So it goes in vitro, and then you go in vivo, which are the animal models, and then you go first in human. Okay. That's oversimplifying it. But in these in vitro studies, you can quickly assess whether or not your compounds bind to a particular target. There are other types of studies that eliminate undesirable effects right away. And so very generally, back in the day when we didn't have computational tools, medicinal chemistry campaigns would take a really long time. Over the past 100 years, we've amassed like millions of compounds in the literature. We can now even quickly make up molecules that have never been synthesized using software and screen them against models of receptors we call it in silico. And so there's a lot of ways to really assess maybe how a new compound or a new compound core that might not be a tryptamine, that might not be a phenethylamine, could actually bind to receptors generally. Now, when you translate that, there's this thing in drug discovery called the translational valley of death. So you can have all of these great leads from your computational tools, even from your in vitro studies and in vivo studies that look great. We've cured Alzheimer's in mice many times, but then you hit this translational valley of death where when you go into humans, like what you thought was going to happen doesn't happen at all. And so when it comes to developing new psychedelics, you would kind of just follow that same pathway. We're at a slight disadvantage with psychedelics because there was the war on drugs. And so research as far as psychedelic molecules go was banned for a while, but we're picking back up now. And I think that, in conjunction with the openness to psychedelic drug development by the FDA, and also the advent of computational in silico screening, maybe we'll be able to catch up quicker than we would have before. But it's really just about changing the molecular structure and screening as much as you possibly can against as much as you possibly can, in order to get a good starting point before you iterate on the molecule. The chemists are the wizards that really tweak the molecule after they figure out where their starting point should be, and then hopefully it translates into humans.
So,
and to go deeper into that, I mean, we can keep talking about it here, but I will say that if anyone wants to do like a deep dive on that, I did record a podcast with another Sam Bannister, this chief scientific officer of Silo, that we talked for like an hour and a half about this. And he talks about how they have like a digital model of like the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the main psychedelic receptor, and how they screen like hundreds of millions of molecules against that, like, in the computer, and then move on. So I would recommend, but happy to talk more about it now. Just want to throw out there, plug that podcast.
Yeah, I'll say also, we'll have a link to that podcast in the description of this video as well. So.
Awesome.
And a question I actually just came to mind now. I think I saw somewhere Silo, they have some collaboration with a Japanese pharmaceutical company now, right? Do you guys want to talk more about that?
Yeah. So Daiichi Sankyo, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They're one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. They're in the top 30 by market cap of like publicly traded pharmaceutical companies globally. Wow. And they signed a sponsored research agreement that's largely focused on those non-hallucinogenic psychedelics.
Yeah.
And I think it's a first step of what hopefully becomes, many more collaborations with big pharma down the road. But it's validating to see that a, big publicly traded psychedelic or pharmaceutical company wants something to do with psychedelics. And, one thing I'll just add that I think is kind of interesting is that if you look at the big pharma companies that have done partnerships with like psychedelic companies, there's Daiichi Sankyo with Silo, and then there's Otsuka, which has done partnerships with Compass and Mindset, I believe.
Yes.
Both Daiichi and Otsuka are Japanese pharma companies. And, I think sitting in here in the States, I personally don't exactly know much about the psychedelic scene in Japan, but, in general, those are very conservative places when it comes to, attitudes around drugs. And so it's kind of interesting that there's this level of interest from Japanese big pharma in psychedelic medicine.
Yeah.
I agree. Why do you think that is?
I honestly don't know.
Good question.
Sam, do you have any thoughts?
There's a boring answer when it comes to companies that have traditionally and historically focused on central nervous system diseases or psychiatry in their pipeline over the years. And if you look and find some of these specialist organizations, I'd argue that Otsuka and Daiichi are some of those. They also have other therapeutic areas of interest. But a lot of these companies will look for new waves in, let's say, psychiatry when they're either reaching a patent cliff themselves. So that means that a lot of their assets are going to kind of come off patent soon. Or B, they are realizing that there's a new general trend happening in that overall therapeutic area, and they want an edge. So if we think about psychiatry, we have Sage Therapeutics that has recently gotten their drug approved for postpartum depression. There's a whole new set of rapid acting antidepressants that are coming to the forefront, and psychiatry is seeing a boom like never before. So it doesn't really surprise me if companies want to remain competitive in the psychiatric area, that they'd be looking for new tools that are very frontier and differentiated as far as their mechanism goes compared to traditional drugs like Prozac.
Sam, if you don't mind me asking, speaking of new rapid acting antidepressants, I know there's this drug Auvelity from Axsome Therapeutics. It's an NMDA antagonist. So I guess similar mechanism of action to ketamine, and it could be taken at home. So I assume there's not too many dissociative effects. Like, how much better could a like these next gen psychedelics without the trip? How much better could they be than Auvelity, for example? I don't know if you followed Auvelity.
Do you know? I mean, I just don't know the details around the therapeutic regimen. Is it
Okay.
is it a drug plus therapy that they're prescribing together?
No, I think it's a combination of well,
DXM, right? It's
yeah,
DXM
Right.
and
and
something else.
Wellbutrin. It's
Yes,
Right.
a
yes.
combination of those. Yeah.
Well, and Brom may have different thoughts here. I'd like to hear his thoughts too. But I think when it comes to the reason why psychedelics are performing so well so far in clinical trials for psychiatric indications is because it's really a catalyst for therapeutic intervention that gets to the root cause of the problem. So in drug development, we talk about these things called disease modifying therapeutics. And to date, Prozac to me is not a disease modifying therapeutic. David Nett from the UK uses this analogy of like the traditional antidepressants being like putting a cast on a leg and then just like hoping it'll heal on its own. But if you have something like inherently wrong with like your bone structure or the way your body heals, that's not going to fix the problem. I'm oversimplifying it for sure, but
Okay.
I do think that psychedelics, they open what Guldullin calls a critical learning period. And others would argue that this is just promoting structural and functional neuroplasticity, but it's really giving somebody the opportunity to learn and explore more about themselves without having, other feelings come up during that process. And so that's why I think psychedelics can be useful. I'm really curious to see how that diverges among the different types of psychedelics and the different types of mental illness that exist. But the one last thing I'll say is, there are a few podcasts and publications on how people would argue that MDMA is actually like the perfect drug for PTSD because it suppresses like the amygdala's activity in response to fear, but it also has an empathogenic effect and makes you really, not just happy to be around and talk to other people, but more empathetic towards yourself. So I do think, learning about more of these subjective effects will help us to better understand how we anticipate these drugs to be powerhouses in different categories of psychiatry. But yeah, I think Auvelity, I'm assuming with a traditional mechanism like that, if it's a combination product, perhaps it's opening these pathways without it being directly mentioned. But without therapy, a lot of the time, you can't just expect to take something and get better. There's other work that you have to do in psychiatry.
Totally.
Brom,
And
I don't know if you had, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say what you were saying about disease modifying. I mean, I think that's why all of us are so, at least I think I'm speaking for you too, Adam, when we're so interested with psychedelics is they seem to, when they work or they get to the root causes is what it seems. So that's, that's something really interesting. And sorry, Brom, I cut you off there.
No, I was just going to say that I think you started off the question with like, how much better could psychedelics be? And
yeah,
I'm kind of the opinion that, I mean, first of all, like you said, DXM is a similar mechanism of action to ketamine. So that drug may be kind of slightly psychedelic, at a certain dose. It's hard to say.
Should be.
I don't know, right? There's a reason that people talk about like Robitussin cough syrup, and
exactly. That's the first thing that came to my head.
So
Said DXM.
it might actually be a bit of a trippy drug itself.
Okay.
But I would say that, the human brain is like really, really complicated, and there's a lot of diversity in like how people's brains are structured. And I just think it's like kind of silly to think that there's going to be like one drug to rule them all as when it comes to psychiatry. Even if you look at like antidepressants now, there's like, I think the top selling antidepressant makes up about 13% of the market. So it's not like other industries where like the top selling in the category makes up like 80% of the market. Like antidepressants are super fragmented, and that's just due to the fact that everyone's brain is different. And, some people actually really, I know in the psychedelic space, everyone loves to like shit on SSRIs, but some people actually really do like SSRIs and they respond really well to them. So I'm less worried about like how much better they could be like for everyone, and more like, there's going to be some people that are going to like this type of thing and some people that are going to like that type of thing and respond better. So that's kind of my take.
Yeah.
And guys, I don't know, Sam, if you have to run, but I'm good for another 15 minutes or so if you guys want to keep going. I know we're kind of at the top of the hour.
Oh, great. Yeah, I have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
And by the way, for some reason, my mind didn't, you're right. Mental health is not a one size fits all approach, obviously. And there's different drugs for everyone. And with psychedelics, it's going to be interesting to for people to get more data on, maybe also who shouldn't go into these experiences because there are risks. Now, this question, I'm very excited to hear what you guys have to say, being that you guys are very tuned into this industry, obviously. So what does psilocybin commercialization look like in the medical world? Is everyone listening to the same music? Is COMP360 protocol the only one used? How much freedom will clinicians have to use different treatment methods with psilocybin, and also different dosing? Because, you know, for example, with Compass, they're using the I guess their winning dose so far is 25 milligrams, but when it makes it to the real world, how's it going to look? Because in terms of dosing as well. Sorry, it was a long question, but
I mean, in terms of like restrictions around the physician deciding what dose you can take, we really won't know until the REMS protocol is in place. I mean, I would assume that REMS will have, Sam, would you say that it's correct to say that the REMS will include guidelines around like what the max dose in a single session might be? Yeah,
Yes.
that's going to be determined by the REMS protocol. And, you know, I highly doubt that the protocol will be so restricted that everyone will have to listen to the same playlist. You know, it would be horrible if it was sort of like, I don't know if you remember when that one iPhone came out and it had like the U2 song preloaded on it, you know, and it's like all you could hear, all you're allowed to listen to is like that one song over and over.
Oh my
the whole
God.
trip.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there will be a lot of variety in the actual environment.
Okay.
I mean, think about like when you go to the doctor today, not every doctor has the same office, right? Like there's already, every therapist has their own office set up. I'm sure some of them will be nicer than others. I don't see why you couldn't have some sort of doctor's office that just happens to not have a roof and you might be outside somewhere, right? We'll see. I think that, you know, you mentioned like music, and we invested in a company called Wave Paths, which is focused. It's basically a software platform that creates like customized and real-time adaptable soundscapes to accompany psychedelic journeys. The guy that started the company did his PhD at Imperial College London, and the focus of his PhD was on the impact that music has on psychedelic experiences. So he literally like put headphones on people, and then like gave them, you know, clinical grade LSD while they were in like an fMRI machine. And then I guess that means he didn't put headphones on them, but probably played some special speakers or something, and measured how their brain changed in responses to different music. And so this company is basically commercializing the learnings from his PhD, which there's some I also did a podcast with him if you want to check it out. But a few of those learnings were, one, everyone is going to have like different preferences around music, and your preferences are greatly going to determine how you respond to things. Another one of the more interesting and like actionable insights is that if you want to maximize therapeutic outcome, you don't want to listen to music you've heard before. Because if you've listened to music you've heard before, your brain even subconsciously has some associations between like that song and like a mental state that you were in back when you listened to that song last. And if you want to maximize like therapeutic benefit, you want to kind of like totally wipe the slate clean and not have any ties back to like the old you. Wow. And so while people may have their favorite like trip playlist, you know, I certainly do, at least according to his research, that's not optimal for therapeutic outcomes. So being able to like have this generative soundscape that is not made up of songs that we have heard before is very, very interesting. And also having it be able to be easily adaptable in real time is very critical, because one of the big points that he makes is that most psychedelic therapies and doctors are not very good DJs. And so you don't want to have someone sitting there like being like, oh, I don't think this music's right. I'm like now scrolling through Spotify trying to find another song. Wave Paths makes it very, very easy for people to just like, there's basically knobs that correlate with emotions. So you could turn up the calm knob, you can turn up the intensity, you can turn up the bliss, and the music will just kind of change in a real-time way. So I think there will be a lot of variance around the experience in practice. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, me putting my serious, you know, like tactical clinical hat on for a second, I think there will be reasonable restriction in the creative latitude that is given to psychotherapists and how they conduct the therapy. But I think the environment and some of the things that Brom are mentioning that are part and parcel to building that environment will definitely vary. But when I think about, you know, some of the issues that we saw on some other podcasts in relating to like previous trials, I won't get into that right now, but when you give too much creative latitude, it's harder to control for the outcome and then study it. So I think over time, there may be a broadening of the therapeutic approaches that the FDA looks at and gives the okay for. But in psychiatry and in clinical psychology, there are different schools that are followed. There's like cognitive behavioral therapy, there's dialectical behavioral therapy, internal family systems, and these are very regimented therapeutic interventions that people use when they're helping individuals in a specific crisis. And so I think when it comes to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, the REMS are really going to be restrictive for the most part in that category. And also, of course, the dosing and perhaps the qualifications of the people that are doing this type of facilitation can have. I think from a facilitation and facilitator perspective, it's going to be restrictive for sure. But yeah, do you agree, Brom?
Yeah, I mean, again, we really won't, this is all speculation, right? Like until the REMS comes out, we won't know. And, the REMS might be more restrictive for MAPS as MDMA because this is like the first time that they're approving a real experiential drug. And by the time Comp 360 gets to the FDA, they might be like, you know what, those REMS on MAPS are a little too tight. Maybe we should loosen them up for this one. Like, who knows what it's going to be like.
I see. Thank you so much. It was great hearing that response. Something I wanted to ask you too for a while. So Brom, this next question for you is for you, and it's about when to sell. And the reason I'm asking you specifically is because I'll never forget. I watched the video the day it came out about you were like, you know what, the top guys at MindMed are selling shares. I'm gonna take some money off the table here. And me, I'm like, no, I'm a long-term investor. I'm not selling anything. Obviously, I wish I could go back in time and would have taken some money off the table. Anyway, enough about my MindMed trauma. Let me get into this question. So how does a VC fund decide when to sell? When you take a look at charts of biotech companies, 99% of the time, it's not like the S&P 500 where it corrects, but it always will end up going back up. Sometimes it has a good run, goes down, never goes back up again. And it seems that there's windows where, I've heard funds say they wait till proof of concept data comes out and they sell are there any instances where maybe you only partially sell out of a company and lock in profits and let the rest ride? I'm curious of what you guys look at when it comes to exit strategies, and especially being so early stage as you guys are in these companies.
Well, the challenging thing about public market or private markets investing is that there isn't a market for these shares. And so I can't just decide that I'm selling, so there's basically a couple options here. The company can get acquired, in which case, the acquiring entity buys the shares from us. The company goes public, at which point we're able to sell after, usually there's a lockup period, but you can sell once the lockup period's over. And then in some instances, if the company's doing well, but they're still private, you can do what's called secondaries, which is like where you find some other VC fund or maybe a high net worth investor and you're like, hey man, like we're still bullish on this company, but like we want to lock in some profits, and maybe this investor really likes this company and wants to get in. And there's a way to do like these private market like one-off transactions, but those are more the exception than the rule. So more often than not, we're probably going to have to wait until IPOs happen or acquisitions happen to sell. And there are some VC funds that will make a very active decision, like, we are not going to sell after the lockup period. We think there's still more juice to squeeze out of this company, so we're going to keep holding. I think for us, what will most likely happen is that once a company IPOs and those shares are now publicly traded, we will likely just distribute those shares to our limited partners, and then they can decide if they want to sell and cash out or not, if that makes sense. So we'll kind of leave that decision up to the investors in our fund. I think the investors in our VC fund, they're paying us to like make these decisions in the private markets. But once the company becomes public, it's kind of like, you should really, I think that you don't really need to make that decision for other people. And then in terms of like, let's say maybe one of the companies that we invested in, maybe Canna or someone, they've raised a Series A, a Series B, and now the company's worth a lot and they're not going to IPO, but maybe someone wants to come and buy some of our shares because they really like the company and they want to get in on it. There's a couple things that usually have to happen in that instance. Like sometimes, depending on the structure of the company, there has to be some approval from the company because like they might have some, like the board of the company might have a way to veto like any of these secondary shares. But assuming they approve the secondary share, there's like a number of considerations. Like if our fund has already had some exits and we've already like returned a lot of capital to our investors, we might say, no, we want to hold it longer because, any more money the fund makes at this point is just like extra gravy, right? Like we've already made a bunch of money to our investors. Whereas maybe we haven't done so hot and we're like, hey, listen, like we need to just return any money we possibly can. So like maybe we should, do that share or do that sale. So it's dependent on a lot of factors.
I see. Yeah. Thank you for answering that. As someone with a long-term, me having a very long-term mindset, I always struggle with, being financially responsible. And, because if I have a long-term view, but let's say a company 10X's, you got to sometimes take profits, even though you have a long-term view. So it's,
and in the case of MindMed, I think, it's worth always looking to see if there's insider selling, right? Like it's a huge signal. If the insiders don't believe in it, like, why should you?
Yeah, I think 90% of the MindMed investors held through that, which is, looking back, it's crazy, but, at the time, didn't even cross my mind. So I appreciate you answering that question. So how has the macroeconomic environment changed the psychedelic startup and venture capital ecosystem?
Yeah, great question. The macro environment has deteriorated significantly since 2021 when MindMed was up 10x and everything. Right now, it's very, very hard to get VC funds to invest in anything. It's hard for VC funds to raise money from their limited partners. And the private markets, not just in psychedelics, but in biotech and in most other early stage tech is, I wouldn't say frozen, but it's moving a lot slower than it did back in 2021. And so, word gets out that it's a lot harder to raise money. That means that people are much less likely to start companies. And we've seen that reflected in just like the quantity of pitches that we get. It used to be like literally like once a day, I would get like some pitch deck from someone just like showing up in my inbox. And now there's still a lot of deals out there, but it's a lot less frequent. I would say the silver lining to like this sort of macro collapse that we've experienced is that back in 2021, when there was just like cash raining down from the sky, it was like everyone and their mom was looking to cash in, and there was like all these like scam companies that were being started, right? And I don't even know that the people running these companies knew that they were scams, but like they were just like shitty companies started by people that had no real intention of like sticking around for the long term. Now, if you want to start a company in today's environment, like the only people that want to do that are people that are like so sure that this is what they want to do and have like really high qualifications and are, going to go about things the right way. So I think that like, while the quantity of deal flow has decreased, like the quality of deal flow has increased. And so the companies that are being started today in general are like much more interesting, much more thoughtful, started by people that have like very serious credentials and that sort of thing. So.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
And I know we're running low on time. I have one last question for you guys. Sure. When it comes to the future of psychedelic medicine or just psychedelics in general, what are you most excited and hopeful for, and what are you most worried about?
DMT vape pens at every 7-Eleven.
Is that the answer to both sides of that
question? Sam, what's your answer? Do you have one?
Again, I'm going to be
I'll give a serious answer
here. My super serious, boring answer. I'm very happy that there's been a renewed interest in psychedelic science as a whole, which has driven this kind of emergence of drug discovery and drug development. I am also very nervous about what happens when psychedelics are approved and broader populations get access to them, and the sponsors of these drugs have to conduct something called pharmacovigilance. I think it's pretty clear that there's going to be a lot of adverse events, which is why there's expected tight REMS controls are expected. Okay. I'm worried about maybe some of the physiological adverse events that might occur, that might show and uncover contraindications in people that no one would have ever thought about before, but are in like rare populations. I'm definitely most excited about these next generation, like the true next generation psychedelic inspired drug discovery initiatives as it relates to neurodegenerative disorders. And just this idea of using psychedelics and psychedelic inspired molecules as a tool for science. That's a whole other discussion. But I'll leave it at that. I'm very excited for psychedelics as therapies, but also as tools. And there's a difference, but I'll keep everyone in mystery.
Yeah, I think that my more serious answer is I am up until this point, like most people that have experimented with psychedelics are people that kind of, they had an intention of trying it. They like kind of had to go out of their way to do it. And so they were mostly people that were kind of already like weird and, like risk takers, et cetera. And we're getting to a point where within a few years, there's going to be like doctors are going to be able to prescribe like, a high quality, 8th mushroom trip, which is really kind of crazy. And when I think about like what's happened in my life when I've had those experiences, especially those first few experiences, I think they radically changed just like I wouldn't say behavior, but my outlook on life and my feelings about what types of risks were appropriate to take in life. And so while people might go into these things thinking that they are just like treating their depression, for example, I think what we haven't really thought about as much is like what happens when like a whole bunch of people that went into their psychedelic experience thinking, oh, this is just a medical intervention to treat my depression. They come out being like, you know what? I actually don't want to spend the next 20 years of my life at this job that I hate. And now I have like the courage to like do something more creative, more risky, more interesting. I think I'm very like excited and also like cautious, like a little bit, not scared, but just nervous about like what happens when you have, millions of people a year that might have like these very like stable yet maybe sort of brittle lives that are about to be like shaken by high quality pharmaceutical grade psychedelics. I think that it could unleash a new era of like human creativity and ambition and flourishing, but there could also be like some interesting like adverse effects, not just like physical or psychological, but also just like socially. What happens if you have a whole bunch of people that had kind of resigned themselves to working these jobs that maybe most people would consider dead end, but are critical to the functioning of society, all of a sudden like equipped with this psychedelic inspired confidence to quit their jobs and write a book or something like that. It could be a very, very strange world that we're walking into.
Wow. I don't know. I could tell you've thought about this question a lot. And now I think after this interview, I'm going to be thinking about all that. That was really a great answer. Thank you guys so much for coming on. I followed you two for a while. I'm fascinated with your fund, and it was really great getting to pick your brains today and learn more about the space and the companies you're invested in. Adam, you want to send this off? Anything to say?
Thank you guys so much for watching. We're going to include links to Brom's podcast and I guess Empath Ventures as well in the description of the video. So if you're interested, you could go to the description, click on what you want to click on. I want to thank Brom and Samantha for coming on the show. We really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. If you guys want a chance to address the audience, you have a second if you want to. If not, you can pass. Leave it up to you.
No, Adam and Jake, thank you guys so much for having us on. Love doing stuff like this. So, maybe 6 months from now, we can check back in and we can talk about how some of these companies are doing and, give you guys some updates. The fund is Empath Ventures. You can find us online at empath.vc. And the podcast is just called the Brom Podcast, and you can find it at brom.fm. And Sam, please go ahead and if you want to sign off or plug anything, go ahead.
Psychedelics as tools. That's all I'm going to say.
Psychedelics as tools.
Yes, but thank you for having us on, and looking forward to seeing more of your interviews that you do in the future.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and have a wonderful, wonderful week.